Hey there, welcome to Transform Network's open conversation on healing justice. Transform Network is a national network of progressive Christians and our friends, people of faith, people of many faiths, people of no faith. We endeavor to work in the realm of transformational justice at the intersections of faith and justice. Our open conversations are free online spaces to explore tensions and topics that we're really interested in exploring more, things that we're really drawn to. And we're really excited to have this conversation this evening. We are going to jump in to the conversation that we just had this evening. We forgot to hit the record button in the beginning. So we're going to be jumping in with our leadership team member, Vahisha Hasan, who is going to be introducing herself. And then you'll hear from Dr. Loretta Pyles, author of this amazing book, Healing Justice, who's also offering a 3-week online class at Transform Network starting later this month. And also licensed social worker and professor Lisa Good is also going to be joining us. And it was an incredible conversation. And I'm so excited to have you all just explore this topic that's emerging in our movements called healing justice. Thanks so much.
At MCUTS at Union University, which is an undergraduate theological school, or we do the undergraduate portion. And I'm also executive director of Movement and Faith, and that is where I am blessed to be able to function at my intersections of faith, social justice, and mental health, and that being like healing and wellness.
Great. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
And yeah, absolutely. And Lisa, would you be willing to introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about who you are.
Sure. My name is Lisa Good, and I live in Albany, New York. And the name of my program is Urban Grief. And much of my community-based work centers around supporting people after violence, particularly community violence like shootings and homicide, but also educating people about adverse childhood experiences, resilience, and really trying to, create safe spaces where people can grieve and just talk about and connect with others after traumatic events in our community. And this work, in part, I see it not just as work, but it's my calling. I'm also a ordained minister in the Baptist denomination. Those were my roots. That's not where I'm at now, but also an ordained minister. And so much of my faith work and ministry work kind of overlaps with the community based work, but the community based work I view as a direct calling, but specifically targeting, our underserved and vulnerable communities where, a lot of oppression and violence and disenfranchisement exists. So.
Wow, thank you so much for being with us and for doing that important work. We really appreciate your presence with us here tonight. Awesome. Well, Loretta, would you go ahead and introduce yourself a little bit?
Sure, great. Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm Loretta Pyles, and my official title is Professor at the School of Social Welfare at the State University of New York at Albany. And my background really started in the domestic violence field, working in the battered women's movement and looking particularly at the intersections of poverty and violence in women's lives. So that's kind of really where my roots are. but I've done a lot of work. I was in New Orleans around the time of Hurricane Katrina, and I ended up doing a lot of work on climate change and disasters and racial justice, which was kind of everything that was happening in New Orleans at that time. And so that's really formed a lot of the work that I've been doing in recent years. And then even more recently, my focus has kind of brought some of these social justice pieces together to bring forth some of my own background in mind, body, spirit healing, using my skills as a yoga and meditation teacher to bring into social justice spaces and social justice work. So that's a little bit about kind of where I'm at now and how I got here.
That's awesome. And I tend to forget to introduce myself when I do these things. So my name is Holly Roach Knight, and I am a co-founder and leadership team member for Transform Network. And I identify as part progressive Christian and part Buddhist. And Vahisha likes to say that I'm Buddhist. So applying the principles of Buddhism, I feel really makes me a better Christian and a better practicing Christian in a lot of ways. So really happy to be having this conversation. And so I wanted to just start off and just say real basic, like, what is healing justice? What are we talking about when we're talking about healing justice?
Great. I guess I'll go first. Okay, so yeah, I think it's an interesting and expansive term in the sense that there's a lot of different entryways into that work, and it's going to be great to hear from different folks on different people's perspective on that. But sort of one entryway into the term healing justice really focuses on activists, community healers, social service folks, teachers, everybody who's really called to do this kind of helping and healing and activist social justice oriented work. And it's a focus on the healing that needs to happen in their own lives and in their communities and in their circles and in their organizations. So in the past, our work has been focused outward, changing systems and doing the work sort of externally. But there kind of came a turn, and I would say really it happened about, roughly a decade ago, where it started to happen, where it was like, well, wait a minute, these systems are impacting us in terms of our minds and bodies and spirits, but also how we're acting, how we're interacting interpersonally, how our organizations functions, our organizations take on the systemic oppression and trauma within the organizations. Are we like reenacting trauma in our organizations? Like, we just came to realize that there's so much work to do internally. And really, feminists have been doing that for a while, and other groups of folks have been doing that work. And we're just starting to give a name to it. And I think with kind of more awareness of how trauma impacts people, and about how historical trauma and systemic oppression impacts people in ways in which we're not always able to understand on a conscious level, that there needs to be like deeper work. And so couple that with more access to like holistic healing approaches, and people having more access to maybe even reclaiming some of their cultural, spiritual, and healing practices of origin. So taking all of that, all of those opportunities there with kind of the needs, then we're starting to get kind of this idea of healing justice, that this internal work that we can do to support each other, ultimately to be able to be more resilient and sustainable in our work in the world.
Thank you for that. I'd love to hear from you, Lisa, and then Vahisha, sort of how you define and approach healing justice as well?
So I think for me, I agree with everything Loretta said, because because she's written so extensively on this topic. But I guess from my perspective, so many times movements or programs start because it's a way for people to make meaning of the trauma and the oppressive experiences that they've encountered. And then that's how it kind of evolves into their identity and to their life and all of those other kinds of things. And I think that for me, my personal experience, that when I started Urban Grief, even though I had my own traumatic experiences around violence and losing people to violence, that wasn't the reason. So, you know, so I think it frames how I went into the work and even how I see it now, that it wasn't the program starting and doing this wasn't, I'm in pain, let me go do something.
Mm.
And I think that probably that in part that came, that mindset or that notion came, one, again, because I felt like it was a calling, but the other piece was also that I think it came in part from my therapeutic training from working in the substance abuse field, which when I came into the field through grassroots and like in the late 1980s, early 1990s, it was, you know, most of the people that worked in the programs were recovering. And so it was almost a requirement, and so to speak, that in order for you to work in the field, that you had to do your own work. And so that, you know, professionally, I think that training and that orientation and working in an environment for so long where there was a expectation of parallel work going on, not just the work you do with them, but the work you do with other people. And you can't, the idea that you can't lead someone where you have not been, you know, I think kind of influenced me. So when I started this work, it didn't come out of that. So I think for me, when Loretta talks about healing justice, like when I first heard her talk about it, that resonated with me very much, because I've been on the inside of, you know, different work, so to speak. And I saw what it looked like on the outside, but I also know firsthand that people's lives were literally in chaos and shambles. So.
Thank you for that. Vahisha.
Greetings again, everyone. I'm having this moment of just deep gratitude that this conversation is even happening. And I just want to name that for people who do this type of work or recognize the value of it. I think it's something to acknowledge that in this moment that we are gathered for this reason, right? And I just want to pause and take a moment to really soak that in, take that in. And I think that that's thematic in what we're talking about, right? So meaning that healing justice is an acknowledgement of harm, and it's both institutional level harm. So we have all different types of oppression. So whatever identity you may embody or perceived identity on behalf of other folk, that you are being harmed in some way institutionally. So this could be, you know, anything from like the prison system to racism, sexism, patriarchy, I mean, all the homophobia, whatever the different, you know, all of these different ways that we are othered and then maligned and marginalized, or at least moved to margins. nationalism, xenophobia, just lots of different ways. And so we fight these things, right? So out of our place of wanting a better world for ourselves, we fight these things. But healing justice is saying, while we're fighting these very valid places, it's really important to keep in mind and intentionally incorporate, we think about action in resistance to these oppressive forces, but this is action and resistance in those oppressive forces, like continuing to harm us as we do the work, right? So how do we continue to be healed and continue to be whole as one can be in an oppressive environment? That it's both important to impact and change the environment, but also be transformed in the work and by the work as we're doing that work. And that transformation, people talk about recognizing your privilege, the more you're educated and recognizing different areas of privilege. But what about acknowledging and recognizing different areas where you have been harmed, where you have trauma, where the oppressive nature itself has damaged you, your home life or your environment. And so healing justice is saying we want justice for our own healing while we fight for different justices against different types of oppression.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I just want to add that as an activist for nearly all of my life, and as a white woman with privilege, I was pretty taken back and sort of shocked at how I really hadn't factored in trauma to my understanding of social justice and social justice movements. I had been adjacent to trauma. I had experienced my own level of trauma, as a child, and not necessarily movement oriented, and had also then, been marching shoulder to shoulder with people who are experiencing trauma in that moment. And yet to me, that oppression is trauma was sort of a revelation on some level. I'm sort of embarrassed to say, because it's not something that was discussed a lot. We didn't have trauma healing therapists available during the meetings, during the mass meetings or whatever, right? So I just want to ask, how does this shift how we organize? What issues in social justice does this sort of illuminate and address?
Can I go first on that one?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. Only because I forgot to say a thing and it answered your part of your thing. I was too busy taking in the moment of the glory. We were even gathered in this way. So recently at Mystic Soul, which is an amazing gathering of faith, just spectrums of faith folks in Chicago, we did a group, kind of a collective of healers in different ways, did a whole workshop or plenary kind of session on healing and trauma-informed healing in social movements and social change. And it was so interesting because, we didn't say clinicians only, but we said people that do some type of offering and some type of healing, whatever that meant. But we ended up getting a lot of licensed clinicians in different aspects of the field. And we kept saying the word trauma, Holly. We said trauma over and over, and we were talking a lot about trauma. And the person speaking at the time, Teresa Mateus, she was saying about the trauma and the things, and then somebody finally said, threw up their hands and was like, hey, can y'all define trauma for us? Because we're almost not able to follow you because our understanding of trauma is not lining, and actually specifically they said, our clinical understanding of trauma is not lining up with what you're saying, but it sounds amazing, but we're not quite getting it. And so it wasn't until we ended up both kind of giving somewhat of our definition of trauma, but also kind of bringing in the wisdom in the room and talking about what trauma meant to folks in the space. And they were like, bells went off. I mean, even for, and these were people of color, spectrum of people of color, right? Black and brown folks, who were like, it never occurred to us that oppression could clinically be trauma. And they were like, this has forever helped us. And they're in their own skin, having this realization and better understanding how they could help others. And just earlier today on Instagram, there was like a feed going across, you know, you can ask questions and people can answer in. And they were like, hey, what kind of microaggressions have you gotten from your therapist? And some of the answers back were, how long have you had this delusion that racism is infecting your life this way? That was the response from a therapist. They named it as a delusion that oppression was trauma. So we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work to do, right? Lisa is like falling out. And I would have to, I can find a way to like screenshot some of these things or send it to you when I saw it. But it was so many people responded and answered in this way, the things that they had experienced from therapists. And so this is very concerning, and definitely we need to broaden our concepts so that in our movement work, in our bodies, in our spaces, in our clinical work, in wherever your healing is happening, that we are more aware of this intersection, like that this cannot be separated.
Yeah, thank you for that. Looked like Lisa had something she wanted to say.
She about fell out. She went,
I mean, but actually, just in terms of my work on the ground with doing grass education. So a lot of my like training work that I do and workshops that I do around trauma is geared towards community members. I mean, I feel like if you're a clinician in this day and age and you don't know what adverse childhood experiences are, and you don't know anything about trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder and all these other kinds of things, then, you know, you need to go give up your license. That's just how I see that.
throw the whole license away.
Throw it all away or do something, because you've been truly in a vacuum.
Yeah.
But yet and still, when I do a community event, I do get, you know, clinicians and people that come, and it's a lot of things that I present. It is new to them. However, that being said, my target are the folks that are in programs, agencies that, and I see this as classism, but that aren't viewed as worthy of being sent to trainings on trauma. So that even within our organizations, within our structures, even within our churches, there are hierarchies about who we deem as worthwhile of, you know, getting trained and making that investment in. And so with that being said, there are a lot of experiences that aren't heard. And so people are always messaging me and saying, where can I go to? What therapist can I go to? And I'm like, I don't have an answer for you, because the ones that are really good that actually could, you know, do something with, they're already. And so my reaction was in part to one, that I'm glad that thread was taking place on Instagram, but just to that notion that that is a very real thing. And so therapeutically, when you are doing engaged, so let's say hypothetically, I'm doing this work, I realize there's a problem, I decide I want to go get some help. And now in the context of getting help, I now, you know, I'm further traumatized because there are only certain experiences that I can bring into that space. And so subsequently, I almost start to take care of the therapist, because now I'm withholding things that could be offensive to my white therapist, right? And so that in it ends up not being helpful to people. But one of the things that I tell people, you know, when they're seeking therapy, when I'm doing workshops, is one, you know, to can own your own story and don't worry about what the therapist is or isn't going to do with that. But also, you know, and this is hard, this is tricky because trauma kind of steals your voice. Oppression steals your voice. It makes you second guess your impressions. It makes you second guess, well, am I just being hypersensitive or hypervigilant? Was that really a microaggression? Did they really mean to say that? Well, they helped me so much over here, but now I'm not feeling quite as safe as I would, you know, like, and what do I do with all of that? And so a lot of times in the workshops I do with community members, once I give them the basic information around trauma and what just in a way they can understand it, the rest of that discussion is almost always spent on how do I navigate and deal with service providers, trained professionals, clinical and non-clinical, who engage in these microaggressions, and because of the power imbalance that exists within the therapeutic relationship and within organizations, I'm not even empowered to address that. And by virtue of the therapeutic relationship, you're vulnerable. And just the idea that, you know, someone is not open to hearing, and I know it to be true from personal experiences, but just the idea that someone would actually say that is just, but it's, again, it speaks to the level of education that's needed out in the field, whether it's social work, whether it's licensed mental health providers, whether it's institutions, organizations, even houses of worship. I mean, you know, I've had people say, clergy say some unbelievable things.
I call it
And
spiritual malpractice.
so from, you know, my experience, there's even an unwillingness to acknowledge the trauma of being oppressed as a female clergy person in in denominations that are very male dominated and male centered. So.
Thank you so much. I just want to take a breath there, because that just deserves a breath. I think that's really hard stuff. That's really painful stuff. So if we're acknowledging that oppression is trauma, how does that change the way that we organize?
Maybe I'll jump in now. And did want to like segue a little bit from some of the things we're talking about here, and even what Lisa was saying and what Holly was saying too. You know, the concept of patriarchy is coming up for me right now. And of course, the flavor of patriarchy that we have is what Bell Hooks calls imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy. That's kind of the flavor of patriarchy. But you know, that Holly, even in the social justice movements that you came up in, which are they came out of patriarchy, right? They functioned in a way that used the tools of patriarchy and the ways of work, you know, patriarchal ways of working. And just like Lisa is talking about the way patriarchy manifests in institutions such as the church, or an example of that. So, you know, and it, to me, it's an opportunity to bring to mind what to me is the larger concept of transformative justice. And, you know, here we are on the Transform Network. And so, you know, there's obviously a good understanding of what transformative justice is, but, you know, it really is, it's about, you know, dismantling these systems of oppression, right, in the work that we do. And, you know, this idea, and I learned early on, back in the early days of the battered women's movement, that these ideas of transformative justice from kind of a feminist lens, that the means are the ends, that the means and the ends are not separate. And we don't want to leave a trail of debris in trying to get to our social justice ends. Like we want, it's kind of this idea of we want to create the kind of world that we want to live in and how we're doing it. And so, things like care become central, care and compassion and relationship, all of those things become really central in my mind. I also just wanted to say a couple of other things too, is, that in that work that, and I think I imagine there's a pretty good understanding of that amongst folks, but, that we, my guess is probably everyone listening in on this call would identify as having probably some parts of themselves that are privileged and some that are subjugated, so that many of us contain both privileged and subjugated selves, and that that both parts of those, and that we have many different, like there's a lot going on there in terms of privileged selves and subjugated selves and intersections and etc. But that too, that I do know that sometimes, white people wonder, well, where do I fit in this healing justice? Like what, and maybe there is no specific experience of trauma that's one's aware of, et cetera, that our privileged selves, even our privileged selves in this context need attention too, right? That this system actually hurts everybody, obviously in very different ways, but that it all requires attention and dismantling in terms of not only just our privilege, but even deeper than that, just how deep white supremacy runs in every single person on this planet at this point, in terms of the way it affects us. So there's just a lot of work to be done there. And then I just wanted to bring attention to one other thing, and that is just, and Lisa is someone who's helped me to shed some light on this in some different ways as well. But just this idea how trauma and trauma interventions can also become another commodity in the marketplace. That what I see too is that trauma and ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, it gets very depoliticized. And it takes us away from understanding the true systemic origins of trauma. I mean, we can talk about trauma all day, but if we're not really willing to talk about imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy as the cause of that, then we're not doing the transformative work that needs to be done. And then people get these, new training badges that say they're trauma informed, this or that or the other. And it's just like, meanwhile, and again, I really, Lisa was someone who articulated this for me really quite well. Meanwhile, people of color continue to experience constant microaggressions in these agencies that are in these spaces that are supposedly saying they're trauma informed and like wearing that as a badge of honor, etc. So I think we just have to be careful with the language and be careful what we're saying we're doing. It just becomes, it's just an opportunity to, I think, slow down and pay attention to our language and how we're doing the work.
Absolutely. I really appreciate you naming that. And I'm wondering, in the spirit of naming and sort of defining the terms that we're using, in case that we do have any viewers who are not familiar with the term microaggression, would you be willing to sort of define that for us a little bit? Or if Lisa or Vahisha want to jump in on that at all?
Do either one of you want to take a stab at it? Okay. Thanks a bunch, you guys. I would say, describe them as, what would be called smaller acts. That's the word micro. Smaller acts experienced on a daily basis that may or may not be intentional on the part of the person saying them, but they have the effect of being painful and reinforcing the status quo. And we use them a lot in terms of and they dig into existing traumas. It's like salt in the wound of historical trauma or other deep traumas related to whatever oppression we're talking about. I think we talk about them a lot in regard to racialized microaggressions, but I think the term can be helpful in terms of other groups that are othered, right? So people with disabilities could give you a laundry list. People who move in the world with disabilities could give you a laundry list of the microaggressions they experience on a daily basis, right? So I think it's a term that's helpful to understand just how deep it goes. And I think one thing that helps us with microaggressions, it's not just about pointing fingers like, there's a microaggression, there's one, calling people out over and over again. That is not necessarily always kind of the productive thing to do. I think one thing it helps me to understand is just how deep the systemic narratives and practices go, and just how much work there is to do, because this stuff runs very deep, and it runs through our minds, it runs through our emotions, it gets locked in the body, and then it comes out. And so there's just a reminder that there's a lot to work with, and this is the long haul. This is that we're in this, for the long haul. It's not like a quick fix.
And so I just want to build on that a little bit, because so in the very practical kind of sense that, so if vulnerable populations, different groups, come to the table with a lot of historical trauma and, trauma from violence and poverty and those kinds of things, and they're Black or brown, and then they're in spaces, workspaces, community spaces, but I'm going to say mainly professional spaces and academic spaces. And so now, throughout the course of your day or your daily activity, you not only have to navigate, your internal response to maybe triggers and, the things that come with having a lot of trauma in your life. But in addition to that, you also have to manage these other things, these microaggressions that are coming at you that can be sometimes very triggering. And so you're not just managing your own business that you come to the table professionally or academically with, but you're also managing all of these other kinds of things, these microaggressions that are coming at you. And a lot of times in the body, at least, they merge. There's a physical, and it has there's a physical sensation to it. So the building that I work in the university, one of the experiences that I've observed over the last 7 months that I've been there is that people don't speak. They speak to each other, but they don't speak to me. And having people to come in the office where I'm at and ignore me, those kinds of things. And so on any given day, not only am I navigating whatever I may have going on with me personally, and in this instance, when I started working that job, I had just experienced a very traumatic loss. So not only am I navigating that, but I'm also navigating these kind of daily types of insulting kinds of behaviors from people in the building that, so that's been a very common experience. And so that's an example. And so it becomes another stressor. And what I noticed started happening is that I was having a visceral reaction when people came in. And I started to become very short-tempered. And so in response to that, I knew that, you know what, I just need to get up and go and walk around the campus for a few minutes, because that's not me. But I recognize that. So the microaggression, even though they're small, and sometimes when they're coming at you, you want to be the bigger person, and like, oh, it's not a big deal. But at the end of the day or at the end of the week, if you engage in any level of self-awareness or reflection, you realize that your value, your worth, your physical strength has been drained or tattered because of that.
Wow. Thank you for speaking to that. I think it's really helpful to have that example of what that can look like. Like that can literally be as simple as someone just not looking at you or speaking to you in your work environment. Like that seems like maybe like a really small thing. Like they might think to themselves, oh, she's busy, or, oh, I don't want to bother her, or whatever. And then how that can actually come from a much deeper place, right? From like a deeper cultural systemic entrainment, and then thank you for naming how that happens in the body, that visceral. I think we tend to think that our emotions are sort of like live in our minds with the rest of our consciousness, right? And that actually emotions actually sink deep into our bodies and can be experienced and felt in our bodies and then healed in our bodies. So I think it's a really important reminder for us. And thank you for speaking to that.
I was gonna give examples if that was helpful. You definitely gave like your personal example, Lisa, which was perfect. I have a best friend that went through that. I mean, and it was used on her like review, like her employee review, and they were like, you don't come around and speak to everyone, and she was like, so why do I have to come around and speak to everyone? Like, why is this ownership on me? And then they had made it some kind of like that she was cold or angry, kind of like the trope, the angry Black woman. But a couple of other examples, I'm looking at a slide that I do on microaggressions and implicit bias. And there are people that hold up the cards. You've seen those kind of pictures where they're holding up what people say to them. And it went right with your definition, Loretta. Brief and Daryl Wing-Sue, PhD, said a brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, or even environmental indignity, intentional or unintentional, that communicates hostile, derogatory, or negative slights and insults. And I would even add othering. It's a way to other. Does that make sense? So even if they don't realize that in the question itself or in the statement itself, they're othering that person and saying, I noticed that there's something specifically different about you because my standard is whiteness, right? And so one of the things that has an Asian presenting person holding a picture, and they say, can you read this? And he showed me a Japanese character on his phone, just because they're like Asian presenting, right? And then there's a Black female, Black presenting female, and she keeps getting asked, why do you sound white? And then there's an Asian presenting man, and he says, they're saying to him, you're not really Asian, because he kind of has like a skater boy kind of vibe, and they're like, you're not really Asian. And so, and this one darker skinned Black female, her says, you're really pretty for a dark skinned girl. So just different ways that, I mean, and people even think that these are compliments, that they're saying things, right, that are complimentary. One person moved from somebody because they said that she smelled like rice. One person was asked repeatedly, so like, what are you? Which is ironic because I was asked that today. Somebody actually asked me, so what are you? And I was looking like, what does that mean? And they were like, well, I mean, ethnically. And I was like, so does that impact our transaction that we're doing now? Like, I have questions around where is this coming from? But also, I'm like a human and very proud to be a Black female, but it's just, who asked? Like, what do you mean, what are you? not, it just was very, very bizarre. And then some woman who's maybe ethnically ambiguous, somebody walked up to her and started speaking Spanish, and they were like, you don't speak Spanish? Just like these assumptions of these things. And they're just, and they happen all the time, like just all the time. And so the prevalence of it, to your point, if you are constantly having visceral reactions, and as we know, the more you have these visceral reactions, then your brain creates pathways in response to these visceral reactions as well. So we're constantly processing harm all throughout our body into our minds. And yeah, so microaggressions are pretty rough.
Ooh, on top of everything you have to do that day. Everything you got to be there.
All the things.
Yeah. Ooh, it's rough. Thank you for speaking to that, y'all. I think that's helpful for some of our viewers. So I wanted to ask, like who is leading the charge in healing justice in our movements? And does that look, differently than it looks like in the academy, or what are the sort of distinctions? I point to the academy because Loretta, you have your doctorate and you've written this book, and you're also, professor and are publishing, and just curious to see, like, are there, who are the experts that are being sort of lifted up in this new emerging field of healing justice?
Yeah, well, and I also just did want to go back maybe a little bit and roll back just a little bit, just to offer, because we haven't really been talking about sort of what the antidotes are, or the ways in which we can sort of work with this stuff. And I appreciated too, Lisa, and Vahisha as well, bringing up kind of the somatic dimensions of this, the neural pathways, and just how there's a somatic dimension to this kind of stuff. And it's a good reminder that we actually also, there's a lot of tools that are available to us to work with this stuff. And so my work really draws from like mindfulness and yoga-based traditions. That's just what I've been trained in, and that's what I know, and that's what I'm able to offer. There are definitely other, like I can imagine like a book on healing justice through an indigenous lens, a book on healing justice through like a West African lens, like where the like healing modalities and the offerings for how to work with trauma and oppression and to support us in our work would reflect like different viewpoints, right? And so, like I said, mine is coming from this mindfulness yoga. I'm also have some training in Ayurveda, and I bring that in, which is the indigenous medicine of India. But so that's just what I know and what I'm bringing in. But things like mindfulness and somatic inquiry into the body and compassion-oriented practices that we can do collectively and individually those are things that can help us expand our capacities to be with this difficult stuff, you know. And I think part of the challenge is, you know, we do a lot of bypassing of this difficult material. Now, in some ways, that can be indicated in some situations, right? Because some people, it's not going to be appropriate for them to like open up to all this trauma in a given moment, right? So we want to kind of, in trauma-informed yoga, we talk about kind of titration in relation to what we're offering, which is namely just awareness of the body, mindfulness of the body. And so you're just offering that in little doses to folks, because you can't just like all of a sudden get people who have been completely checked out of their body for so long and bypassing kind of the pain and trauma that's there. You can't all of a sudden just, you know, put them in a room in total silence and like, you know, get them to like completely check in with their bodies, you know, all at once, right? You kind of dose that out a little bit in terms of that, taking a more trauma-informed approach to kind of the mindfulness and somatic awareness pieces. But those I think those are really powerful tools, and you know, the more that we can share those kinds of tools for people who are interested in them, and when it's appropriate and culturally congruent with who's ever, you know, wanting to use those tools, that's an example of a tool that can deepen our capabilities to work with this stuff. So just wanting to be clear that like there is, on the other side of this, there is a pathway, you know, and it's challenging work, and it takes a lot of commitment. It's a lifelong journey, and it's like just kind of pulling out threads in this fabric, and things just slowly unravel, pulling away kind of layers of the onion, for another metaphor. But, and then just to say, you know, about leading the charge in this regard, I would say from the academic side, to be honest, I don't really see it at this point quite yet. You know, I think there's beginning conversations about it a little bit, but I don't really see really the concept of healing justice coming in. I see certainly talk about trauma-informed language. That's definitely there. But I'm not seeing it through a transformative lens. I'm not seeing it through a social justice lens so much. And then kind of the more of the social justice folks who have been kind of doing this work all along, again, in the academic realm, in terms of fields like women's studies and people who do more critical theory kinds of approaches to various social justice issues. Like, I think what's missing there tends to be more of the embodiment piece and the piece about kind of looking at the whole self. So I'm not really seeing it come together quite yet in academia. And then on the non-academic side, though, personally, I would point to somebody like Angel Kyoto Williams, whose book Radical Dharma and her work is really inspiring. And then I would also just point to Adrienne Marie Brown's work. Those two, for me, her book Emergent Strategy, and then her newest one, Pleasure Activism, I think are both important contributions to the conversation.
Thank you. Vahisha, Lisa, where are you seeing healing justice and our movements manifesting, and who's leading the charge in this work? How do we recognize this work when we go
some
out?
of my examples are going to be like groups of people as opposed to singular like authorships or academic kind of an academic approach. So there's a collective that does House of Breath, and that's in the South Bronx. And the breath is like spelled out as an acronym, and it stands for balance, restore, empower, affirm, transformation, and embody. And
Mm.
they do breath circles, and it's considered sacred healing space for
Mm.
liberation in communities for people of color, and specifically they definitely have a lens for women. And then there's a couple of groups that like I'm in or a part of or follow, and they just give a lot of resourcing and tools and do a lot of on the ground work. And that's Therapy for Black Girls is kind of a pretty dope set of folk. And then Melanin and Mental Health is a set of folks. And then Spirit House is in Durham, North Carolina. And they're, man, they do like cultural organizing. And one of the things that they name as cultural organizers is that healing and wellness is a part of culture. Like there's not a separation between that. And so they were some of the first ones that started the intentionality around having wellness spaces at actions or meetings or anything. So they intentionally set up these wellness spaces and curated what that can look like, and then gave resources to the community. And they're having their, like, I think their 20-year anniversary at the end of October, October 24th in Durham. And so, I mean, just look at that. That's 20 years. So this is not emerging. This is not, this is not just something that has been thought of yesterday. These are folks that have been doing it for a really, really long time. And from this lens, but no, they haven't published, a Oxford Press book. So then, it just depends on who gravitates toward it. But movement folks, by and large, definitely have. And part of in the South, I'm in the South, and so there's a lot of movement happening in our context, and so Southern people are very familiar. And then she does come from a faith context, but Monica Coleman's book, like Bipolar Faith, and that's just one of the newer ones, but and she has a couple, but that gets into integrating mental health in faith bodies, but almost embodying like this faith and then embodying your wellness and what that can look like. And so those are just a couple of options. I was trying to remember the name. I know the individuals, but I was trying to remember the name when we were just at Highlander's Homecoming. Highlander is this amazing Highlander Research and Education Center. We were just there for the homecoming 2 weeks ago, and there was a group there, and I know like Akua and some of the other people who did it, but I don't know the org name, but they set up a wellness space that was like running 24 hours and available for people to enter in. And the ways that they made it available for people to enter in spoke to a broad cultural range, a broad faith range, or whatever that looks like to folks. And it was really meaningful and important. And I just got a response, and they just said that they're like a collective of people that do that work, but again, in the South. And so I guess my main point of saying this is to just stress that it's happening a lot in movement spaces, that it is not an anomaly anymore. And again, my context is in the South, and that's the most experience that I have. I have not gone to a gathering, meeting, action, or otherwise in a really long time without, these people being present. And as you know, Holly was, and several other folks were with me in Charlotte during Charlotte Uprising, and we had clinicians that came and volunteered their time 24 like hours a day. But we also had people who did body work, everything from acupuncture to massages to psychotherapy, whatever the, kind of the deal was. But we were able to move people from maybe physical harm that happened with tear gas and things like that, and move them to a healing space where they could address what they just went through, but also how they go through that on top of what we're talking about, on top of just living in an oppressive environment, not just a crisis moment, right? So I think these things are happening a lot more, and I think this is one of the times where the scholarship will follow right? What's already happening. A lot of times people in academia, being kind of one of them, will write theoretically and will talk about these theoretical concepts. But I think this is a time where the theories will actually come out of like a reflection of practice of what's already happening on the ground. And if I ever actually turn in my PhD application, then I will be one of those. But I think that they're happening. I think that this is happening. And I would also throw out Teresa Mateas, who I mentioned earlier, and she just had a book just come out this week about specifically her kind of assimilation and acculturation, a journey of identity in states of oppression. And so she talks about that. And as a clinician, I think she's a licensed clinical social worker, then she gets into into healing justice concepts, as well as trauma informed. So just it's out there, it's happening, it's great.
That's great. Lisa, did you want to add anything?
Well, I think that for me, at least in my work, Loretta's book kind of opened my eyes. She did a workshop at the university a couple of years ago, her and another professor, and it was didactic, but it was also process. So we learned, we heard, and then we broke up into small groups and actually did the work. And so for me, it was, I got to see it and learn and experience it at the same time.
Mm.
And I chose to make use of that space, and it didn't matter who was there, and I did, which was very helpful. That being said, one of the challenges that I have is that we can have organizing events, meetings, that kind of thing, where the community is outraged about something or incidents that happen, and people will come together and they're very triggering. And to bring up the trauma, or when things become hostile, and say, wait, this is the manifestation of the trauma symptoms. This is what it is. Can we regroup? Can we do this in a different way? At least in this region, I've found that to be challenging. The other thing that, just as an observation, this is a little risky, but I'll go ahead, is everybody's angry. Everybody, all the time. And so that impacts how people engage with allies. So there's a lot of alienating, but also just when I see the constant anger, and it's just always, and it's not balanced with any reflection. For me, those are movements that are unsafe for me to be involved in, because there's a lot of pain in the room, and I don't always see the willingness. Now, people will say they have language now because of some of the work that you referred to. There is language, but there still is this kind of almost like a badge of honor that my work is this work. And even when we're not saying that, that's the message. And because by nature, I'm a healer, when I'm in those spaces, I'm very aware of that. And I'm also more aware of my own reactions and responses to that. And so, I think for me, the next step is, how do we have these conversations with folks in the movement who don't have access to some of the resources and collectives that you reference, because they're not present. they're not present. And so I think for me, the work I do, and we do have like locally, we do have this group called Root 3D, and they opened a space, and they've been doing weekly events, drop-in support events, and it's a studio, so they're doing a lot of body work. And so I know people are using that space. So I think for me right now, locally, that's one of the more progressive things that I've seen launched in the community. I know that there's been recently a Clinicians of Color collective that's kind of started. I've not been there yet, but those are some of the things that are kind of picking up some traction locally. But again, for me, when I'm in those spaces, you know, again, some of these folks aren't, I'm not saying that any specific spaces, but for me, when you do work, there's evidence of it. And part of the evidence is how you show up. And part of the evidence is how you deal with conflict. And part of the evidence is how you take care of yourself. And part of the evidence is the expression of voice that is conscious about doing no further harm. And so I struggle with the hypocrisy of we want to come together and talk about the harm that oppressive systems do, but yet and still we are in these spaces, inflicting microaggressions on other groups and other people, and not having authentic presence and communication. And so that's a tension for me, and it's a place of peace that I'm not willing to forfeit. So therefore, I'm very selective about what I choose to show up in. And so that's kind of my assessment, on the ground. And just even at the very most basic door-to-door level, this means nothing to the people that are on the street. It don't. I mean, it doesn't. And so I think that until we have a way to have a continuum of conversation, which is if community leaders are organizing around a particular issue, that the same veracity that they at this issue, they must also acknowledge and be that intentional about bringing healing into the space. And so that's kind of where I see it right now.
Thank you for that. Yeah. I think that sometimes activist culture can be pretty toxic. Social justice cultures can be insular. Like we're the group of people that get it. And then, right? Did you want to say something, Lisa? Go for it. Oh, you're muted.
That right there is, that's big. And so I think that, again, in this region where I live, there is a lot of covert racism. The city where I live, it was run like a plantation for a very long time. And so now that we are having more social activism, one, we have history. There are lots of historical movements that were housed in this region that had national impact. And so I think that we have activists who don't know the history, so they think they're the first on the scene. And that's a little bit disorienting because they don't know their history. But the other thing is that, yeah, we're the people that get it. And there's even language that goes with that. that even if you go to a meeting and you want to participate, because of the language, it's almost like being with clinicians. They have their own language. Well, the movements have their own language. And if you come into a meeting and you don't know those language and you say the wrong thing, then, and so who got time for all that? And so the average person, the average person, the person that you need to come out and vote, the person that you need to show up at the rally so that it's not just white people that got time to take off from work and show up at the rally, those people, they're not trying to sacrifice a day off from work that they don't get paid to show up for something that they're not sure if they fit. And even though you're saying that you're speaking for them, if we're in the room and you're not sensitive and aware enough that you need to tone down the language that goes to the movement so I can feel a part of, I'm not making that sacrifice. I'm just not. And so I think that there is a disconnect between that very thing that you got, you know, you're leading the charge. It's trauma informed, but for everyday average people who we really need to, you know, help to elevate their collective voice, so that we can get some movement and so that they can find healing and voice. I think that piece right there is harmful, but I also believe it's the evidence of the work that we need to do on self. And so I don't have judgment about that. And the people that I can approach, I do. But it's very disconcerting.
Yeah, thank you for that. I just want to say that I'd like to sort of apply this to communities of faith as well. Because so often, and I think this is sort of a marker of supremacy culture, right? A marker of scarcity, a marker of, you know, there's not enough love and acknowledgement and resources to go around. And so we have our own culture. We have this own thing that we're doing. And in, you know, Christian supremacy culture, we often do not explain the culture of our church to newcomers. Like, we say we're inclusive, but where is the inclusivity? Where is this is how we do this, and this is why we do it this way, right? Like, where is that in a lot of churches? Yeah.
Or we say in the vernacular what Lisa is saying, or we don't even use the word inclusive, right? Because there's so many people that will say the doors of the church are open. And that's for someone, they may think that means inclusivity. And that's not what that means at all, unfortunately, in practice. And so, yeah, it is a sad state. And I think in that practice in the liberation, we seek peace. We have to find better ways of doing that. And some of that has to come with accountability. And I'm finding for myself, and this is kind of everyone else, is that there just has to be, or should be, an investigation of accountability. So there are so many people that are still adhering to like this very rugged individualism, right? Western concept of being an individual. And there isn't a lot of accountability. So if you're in movement space, whether you say that you are leading people or you are allies, whatever it is, who are you accountable to? Because at the same time, people will go in, and the minute they're disillusioned, or to your point, Lisa, you know, they're, depending on how they're treated in the space, but then they leave and go home. And then because they can, the opting out, right? But then also the folks who are harming folks in movement spaces, who are they accountable to? And if we don't have ways, right, if we don't have ways to define that accountability, or have some self-determination, even a little bit of accountability, then we have real problems, because people are moving just any kind of way. And that is not the liberation that we're seeking.
maybe I'll just jump in. Yeah, this is such a rich conversation, and just this idea of exclusion and inclusion and how that impacts us in so many different ways. You know, we live in this culture of exclusion, right? Where young men of color get excluded from the classroom. They get, excluded by being incarcerated, right? We have, and we're excluding people at the borders, right? It's just exclusion everywhere. And so that's what we see all around us. And so it's no wonder we don't know how to do inclusion, right? It's no wonder we don't have any models for how to really do inclusion. You know, I grew up in a home where love was a commodity. You know, you were either in or you were out, and you didn't know when that was going to happen. You know, when you didn't know when you were going to get the love or not, and it was a commodity that you, like you were saying. And then I want to just extend that to, so we want to create inclusive spaces in institutions, in schools, and in all the sort of institutions that we're interested in, in businesses and other kinds of spaces where we want inclusion. But yet it's a little hard to do that when we don't know how to do that with ourselves. And so for me, this is where the kind of the micro level, almost cellular level work of something like mindfulness can help us, because mindfulness really, to me, is about a radical inclusion, a kind of radically including all of the parts of ourselves, the parts of ourselves that we don't like, the parts of ourselves that we put a lot of energy into pushing away. And that takes a lot. There's a lot of energy just to do that, right? There's a somatic dimension to like pushing all this energy away that we don't like. I don't like this part of myself that's angry. I don't like this part of myself that's sad and depressed. I don't like this part of myself that engages in addictive behaviors, right? All these parts of ourselves that we're like pushing away, and we don't know how to be inclusive in our own body, mind, spirit continuum, right? So I think that's why there is kind of that level of work to be done, because if we're excluding parts of as long as we're still excluding parts of ourselves, then we're going to keep projecting that onto other people and keep engaging in those kinds of exclusive kinds of behaviors, excluding kinds of behaviors. So it seems like there's a connection to be made there.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I think that sort of radical self-acceptance is maybe a big part of doing the internal work of social change. Like, we need to become the people who can live in this world we envision, right? This better world that we want to create. We have to become those people. And in order to do that, I think part of that is this process that you're talking about of accepting ourselves, so that we can bring our whole selves into the work of social justice. And how can we, accept others if we're not able to accept ourselves, And the more that we keep this sort of the stuff we don't like about ourselves in the shadows, right? We suppress that stuff. It just gets more powerful and more scary and more threatening, where we can become more at odds with ourselves. And I think a lot of times that stuff is kept in the body, that emotion we don't like gets suppressed in the body. And then the body is not a safe place to go to and to explore and to feel our feelings, to really feel the full range of our emotional experience. It's really scary. Can be really scary. I think a lot of folks sit down to meditate and they're like, nope, this is not happening. Too much of the hamster on the wheel in my head, and I don't feel safe in my body. I'm not sitting in this room with my eyes closed. Hell no.
Absolutely. And if we look at our self-talk and how abusive our own self-talk can be, it's no wonder that we find ourselves in these social justice spaces that are fixated on call out culture and pointing fingers and continuing to, use the master's tools to try to dismantle the master's house. So it's no wonder, so it's, yeah, we just, there's just so much to be learned. We look at the relationship between the individual and the collective.
Yeah.
I was going to say something that set me free that was really helpful with mindfulness, because I am the person that cannot sit in the room, or not yet able to sit in the room with my eyes closed and be the mindful. But I got really good at like going into my body. And if I do like an intentional tightening of things and then breathe it out, so then I can find where tension is and find some of those things. So that helps me. But I had to do with something, like almost thinking of things as the absence of something I didn't do well. But if you gave me like a task, then I could do it. But the other thing that for real that set me free was somebody was like, it's not a matter of emptying your mind, right? Like for you, maybe follow, because I have the 100,000 thoughts. I'm one of those people. And they were like, follow the thought. And I was like, what? And so I was able to, like, rather than try to block out the 100,000 pathways that it was going, it was like, find one and follow it all the way wherever it goes, almost like a stream of consciousness if you would write, but it was like a mental stream of consciousness, if you will. And that helped me, and I could do that, and then I would totally kind of center in that way. So it also helps, to your point of, or all of the points that have been made, just to have folks with different types of training and different ability to meet people where they are culturally and in a lot of different ways, right? And not come with the specificity that also leaves people out and doesn't leave a way for some people to enter in.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It's just in terms of that point about meeting people where they are, mindfulness, like the sitting still, eyes closed kind of mindfulness. I mean, that's just one type of many contemplative practices that are available to people. And it's really contraindicated for quite a lot of people, actually. It's just not it's just not gonna be helpful, right? Movement oriented practices might be more helpful. Or
I dance. I just, whether music or not, if I'm in the room, but if I am able to move in that space, I'm like so good. That's a complete centering for me. Yeah.
That's actually a really sort of a sweet question I'd love to pose to you and Loretta and Lisa. What are your practices? What are your centering healing practices? Vahisha dances. I've seen it. I know it's true.
And music, I'll do music, especially if it's with another person. Like, we'll basically DJ. So it's like a very impromptu, anybody names any song and we just play it. And then we sing the lyrics, and then it takes us back to when we first heard the song or whatever was happening at that time. So for me, a lot, it takes me back to Chapel Hill, to college, or it takes me to middle school with It's So Hard to Say Goodbye with Boys II Men, right? Like, so these things happen and it brings these fond memories, or it doesn't, but you process them and you feel them and you allow yourself to do that. And that's one of my favorites, is this DJing with other people. And then, the dancing really helps me, and anything in the nature where I'm moving. Holly, have to, like, I can't sit still in the nature, because then the nature might get me. But if I'm moving in the nature,
This is true.
if I'm moving in the nature, then I love it. So those are some of mine. Oh, and I have a nap ministry for show.
Oh, yeah.
Now, the
Naps.
Nap Ministry is an actual place in Atlanta, Georgia. It opened up. It is called the Nap Ministry. And you can go in there and get you some lavender and a nap and be an adult, and it is great. But I personally have a nap ministry. I can turn the camera around. I have a couch in my office, and woof, it's great.
Naps are life. Awesome. What about you, Lisa? What are your healing practices?
So for me, I definitely have to walk. I have to move as well because of the work I do. Um, I over time I became very aware that um, I would be very, very tired and just heavy and achy and stiff. And I realized that it was because of all of the vicarious trauma that I was taking in. And so, at first for a while, I used to beat myself up because I was tired. And so even being in school, being in the doctoral program, my research is centered around community violence, gun violence, and it's so doing the research, reading the literature, and then actually doing the work in the community at the same time. It's been a hindrance. So I had to learn to be way more intentional about that. And so I think the first act for me is just compassion for myself, to have compassion for myself. And when I hold on to that notion of compassion for myself and saying, wow, this is a lot that you're dealing with out in the community, ministry wise, family wise, academic wise, this is a lot. Um, and just having self-compassion. And when I hold on to that notion, then the decision to listen to my body becomes easier, in as much as that like when I meet with people, I already know I'm going to bed at 8 o'clock or I'm going home, I'm going to sleep. There is time budgeted for sleep because I have to recover. And if I don't do that, then it doesn't get better. So when I have that notion, hang on to the thought, it's okay to practice self-compassion. And then that empowers me to make decisions, to go walk, to take a nap, to eat mindfully. And what I mean by eating mindfully is to not be just eating whatever is gonna, get those serotonin levels up so I can feel better and not think about that pain that I just witnessed in the life of someone else. So, movement, I get a massage once a month. I have to, and I don't even have to say a word to this lady. She knows. She's like, I don't know what you've been doing. I don't know what's going up there on there at that university. I don't know. But she's like, I'm gonna need you to schedule more time. Like she can talk to me about my body, and so she can, so that's been helpful to even have that conversation because I have that guidance. And then I go to therapy. I go to therapy. The university has the counseling center, and my therapist is this white man. He's probably much younger than I am or whatever, and I wear him out, and he don't even get to say nothing. I go in there and I throw up, okay, and then I eat his candy, and I'm like, okay, time up, see ya, But I had to do that, and the last part of that is the work I do is so crisis driven that I kind of found my body always hyper aroused and always, and so the body work, the movement, and holding on to the intention that I am worthwhile caring for, and that I am the tool. And if I don't keep my tool sharp and preserve my tool, then I can't pass on the work. It's not going to be sustainable. And so that's kind of where, and then, the last thing is worship. I'm a worshiper. So I'm a worshiper. And in the context of worship, I am able to cry. I am able to cry. And I think that there are so many And I hear this, I know they have say, well, men don't cry, but I got to tell you, I'm hearing more Black women. I mean, it's all these women tell me, I don't cry. I mean, I'm like, no, you don't cry. My mother said you don't cry. Like, you can't cry and shut up. And so there are a lot of women that have been given this baggage of, as a strong Black woman, you do not cry, you do not show your emotions. And so I see that a lot. And so for me, because I do see so much, and because the work is crisis driven, you know, I can't cry in that moment, although I do sometimes just sit with families and cry, because the horror of it all, there's nothing else for me to do in that moment is to cry with them. But worship for me is a place where I can empty out all that I've taken in, all of the emotion, all of the trauma. And it's in that space that I can really kind of now breathe and do, and you know, and do some of the more meditative kinds of things. And I do a lot of breathing throughout the day, a lot of breathing, sitting still, closing my eyes, and taking those breaths and letting things wash over me, as opposed to letting them get in me. And but it all starts with the notion of self-compassion, that I'm worthy of being the benefactor of this great wealth of compassion that I so freely give to other people. I am worthy of that. And that's helped me tremendously.
That has also helped me, Lisa. Gracious. You just, Lauryn Hill strummed quite a bit of my pain with your finger. So I am one of those Black women that don't cry, but I was not given those messages. I wasn't given like you must be fortified in this way. I am very emotional. It just doesn't manifest in tears or things. Like, it's just kind of weird, but very helpful, since I'm my most best in crisis situations. But yeah, right, same. Yep. So, but where I can cry freely is in worship. Like, I mean, just all the tears everywhere, all over the place, and every aspect of worship, whether that's in the prayer, the music, the sermon, the whoever, the babies dancing, the grown folks dancing, whatever it is. Somebody run past me, I'm gonna cry with them. Like, I just, I am so free in this moment, and I feel that sense of freedom, but I don't hold my tears. So I'm not like holding my tears or trying not to cry. It's just my emotionality for some reason just doesn't typically present that way. So it's a little interesting. But I felt myself reflected in a lot of what you said, and I think there's something to that. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you. I'd never actually thought about worship as a sort of permission giving space to integrate a full range of our emotion, and that's really interesting to think about that way. Thank you both for speaking to that. So, believe it or not, sorry.
Socially acceptable either. That's
what?
not that what you just described. That's not always socially acceptable. So to even do that, I had to make a conscious decision that with everything that I carry, I choose, and that's not always convenient. It sometimes makes other people uncomfortable, but again, and so I just want to acknowledge that that's not something people are like saying, go girl, you go ahead, cry, scream, if that's not even the part of the service you're supposed to be doing that. It's not always socially acceptable, especially if you're in a platform with a bunch of men. They were like,
what are you doing?
What you doing? So I just
stop.
Throw that piece in there, is that it's a risk. It is a risk to practice self-care so that you can continue to be present for other people, has required for me to take radical risk and be transparent and authentic and present, whatever that looks like in very unusual spaces. So, yeah.
Wow, it's a courageous thing, right?
I cried like a baby child at a plenary workshop at Union Theological Seminary in New York. My pastor, Gina Stewart, she wasn't even my pastor at the time, but she was speaking at a plenary session. And when I tell you, I cried like a whole baby child, and grown women ran around the room like it was the church. So, yeah, but it is a choice, and some people will look at you and, oh, it doesn't take all that, or question what you're going through and can't receive it fully as just an exhale, a place of healing, a place of expression. But listen, do it anyway.
Thank you. That's awesome. Well, I don't know where the last hour and a half went. It just seemed like it was a long amount of time, and it just flew by for me. For folks who are interested in exploring more of what we've been talking about, I wanted to throw out some additional resources. Check out Generative Somatics online. If you're interested in somatics, they have a very politicized, very holistic way of looking at somatics. I'd recommend. Would also recommend Kate Werning's Healing Justice podcast, which does a really good job of highlighting lots of different voices and practitioners who are in movements doing this work day in, day out, as well as the work of Relational Uprising that has a really lovely model that they teach the relationship building and the care that we can bring to our movements to bring a more holistic sense of care while also acknowledging, that the world is on fire and some people are impacted more than others. So really, really great resources there. And another most exciting resource that we're going to have available at Transform Network is we're doing a 3-week online course with Loretta and Lisa. Very excited to be endeavoring in this work with you all. It starts October 13th and goes till October 31st. And I just wanted to call on Loretta to speak a little bit to why you might want to come spend, 3 weeks in this online course exploring this work of healing justice.
Great. Thanks, Holly, and thanks everyone for this great conversation this evening. And this is deep stuff we're talking about, and it takes time to really go into it. And if you're really interested in like going on a journey with this stuff and looking at the whole self, looking at the parts of yourself that we oftentimes don't get to bring attention to, our bodies, our hearts, our spirits, our relationship to community, to nature, all of that stuff. We're going to look at all of that stuff and offer you some tools and support for how to do that. So I think it's a great opportunity. Also, there's some research that says 3 weeks is like the sweet spot for starting a new habit. Like if you do something for 21 days, then it sort of becomes kind of ingrained into the neural pathways, right? So 3 weeks is a really great time period in which you, like, if you're interested in embarking on like some sort of I'll call it contemplative practice for lack of a better term, and like just keep that really big so that can become whatever you want it to be, whether it's dancing or knitting or whatever it is, or some sort of stillness practice or whatever like that. The course is going to allow you space to begin to develop something like that. So it's a great opportunity to really give a gift to yourself, and may it be for all beings. So I really hope you'll join us.
Well, thank you so much. We're really looking forward to that. This has been an incredible conversation. Lisa, Vahisha, Loretta, Thank you so much for spending time with us this evening. And thank you everyone who joined, and thank you in advance to folks who are going to view this after the fact. For folks who joined late, we will be emailing and posting this video in the Facebook event, as well as if you registered, we'll email the link to you as well. So you can learn more about Transform Network at transformnetwork.org. And please join us, like our page online, and please join the Transform Network Facebook community group as well on Facebook. So thanks so much. You guys are amazing. Thank you for doing this work. And it's just a real honor to get to be in this conversation with y'all. Thank you. Everyone, take care.
Thanks, Holly. Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye
you.
now. Thanks. Bye-bye.